All right, we have us a drive shaft, obviously for Truckstang because that's what we're working on. Been wrestling with the idea of whether I want to take it to the shop and let them build the drive shaft or do it myself. It only needs to be shortened, which is a lot easier than lengthening it. But while it says that funding such an operation is kind of difficult at the moment, it's nice to be able to do stuff yourself. So anyway, there's a few steps that you have to make note of in the process of building a drive shaft. The biggest one is maintaining balance. And part of maintaining balance, the first part actually, is our yoke ends. If you notice on a normal drive shaft, they are perfectly in line with one another. You must maintain that perfect straight line, otherwise your drive shaft will be out of balance. So the other thing that has to be noted is run out, what they call run out, where they put a stationary gauge on somewhere underneath the car, put the drive shaft on, put the gauge end up against the drive shaft, rotate the drive shaft, and the amount of wobble that the drive shaft has designates how much run out you have. Obviously you want the shortest number possible, because you don't want none of this. You want just a perfect rotation. But in order to do that, when you take your yoke off, the one guy I've read about doing it, he would just knock the yoke back in there and tap it as need be as he's rotating it to get that smallest run out number. And then once he gets that number, he'll go ahead and tack weld the yoke in place and make sure that run out number still stays where he needs it to be before doing a final weld. Another thing, speaking of welds, is you want to maintain a perfect even weld all the way around, because too much slag in any one point will throw it off balance. Might have to do some grinding. Now, as far as shortening the drive shaft, in layman's terms, you got to measure from the tail of the transmission to the face of the rear end, and I guess at some point you would determine, based on the length of the drive shaft, how much tube you have to cut off. Now, I'm not sure exactly how the shops do it, but I guess the best poor man's way of doing it may be to put the drive shaft in, put the front yoke into the tail of the transmission, mount this yoke onto the face of the rear end, and then bring the drive shaft up, and then just kind of get a good line of measurement between the tube, well, what would be the end of the tube, and the face of the yoke right there, and see how much crap you got to cut out. Or if you just don't mind, just sit there and just nick away a little bit of tube at a time until you get to the point where it's actually in line. Now, we will look at that real quick just as well to verify what others have done, just to confirm what step we may use. But that's where the slip yoke also comes into play. It kind of gives you a little bit of leeway as far as the amount of tube you cut off, because the drive shaft's going to actually do this number anyway. As the suspension is bouncing, it allows the drive shaft to pull in and out so it can operate properly. Anyway, even when you cut the tube, you have to cut the tube perfectly straight, like perfectly straight. So when you do weld your yoke end back in, it too will be perfectly straight, so your run out number is low. So like I say, we'll have to go ahead and carefully cut that weld out, get our yoke out, then go ahead and do our measurements for how much tube we have to cut off, and go ahead and cut the tube down. It's only going to be like a couple of inches, not much at all. And then go ahead and go through the other procedures for doing the run out and all that other crap. So go ahead and get that crap started. Got our back yoke out, looking at the tube. Well, that was one hard part done. Now, next thing will be see how much of this crap we need to trim off. So, time to go under the car. Okay, we're under the car now. Took a moment to put 2 bolts in on our rear yoke to secure it to the drive rear end face. Also put our front yoke in on the transmission tail, so that's all the way in. I'll probably pull it out a smidge, but what we would look at here as far as getting a rough idea of how much tube we got to cut off, we could go ahead and line this up, and based on where that weld cut is, we want to take off that much tube, which, as you can see, is about, if we could focus, it's about maybe 1.5 inches, give or take. So we're just going to need to trim off. I'm going to start off, I'm going to mark this off camera with the permanent marker, but probably trim off maybe a smidge, well, maybe a little bit more, because I got to slide the tail, slide the yoke out a little bit. But we're going to mark it with the drive shaft all the way in the transmission. I'll go ahead and mark it just where this weld is at right here. Like, line it up with the drive shaft, mark that, and trim that off a little bit past that line, so I'll have some play in the yoke. And then fit this back together and see how we look as far as fitment. So go ahead, get this marked, get it cut, and move from there. Stand by. Okay, we pretty much have our drive shaft pre-done. I put the thing in a bandsaw with a brace holding up one end of it. I put a level on both the drive shaft and the saw body to make sure everything was perfectly level, so I could actually do a straight cut all the way through. Then I went ahead and made sure we were in line with our yoke base, or a U-joint yoke base thingy, and tapped that back in place according to where I marked the line at, which pretty much a straight line. I had 2 lines because one of them was a slight bit off, but yeah, hopefully we're in place pretty good. That's where the balancing will come in if it's not perfectly in line. But I tapped that back in. Now it's not welded, it's just tapped in, because that'll be where we have to do our run out measurements. In order to do that, I have to remount this whole drive shaft as is, and then put the run out, the dial indicator tool in place, and do all the rotating and everything to get the measurements, so I could further tweak this thing to get it straight. So I'm going to go ahead and mount this thing and go ahead and get our dial indicator in place. Okay, we've got our magnetic mount and our dial indicator in place. It depends on your setup, but the best approach I found was to mount it on the front of the differential here and adjust it accordingly, so the thing is actually sitting on the end where I need to measure it, because there's our yoke base thingy, and it's knocked into the end of the tube right here. So it's in contact with it. Now, the way this gauge is set up, it's upside down, but you get the idea. When it's in a standby position, it's not on 0. You almost have to kind of set it to where, yes, this thing would focus. Come on, focus you. When the thing is in standby, it's not on 0. It'll be kind of back a little bit. When you set the thing in place, you'll kind of push down a little bit on it. When you're setting it, kind of push down on the plunger right here till you get it to where it's on 0. And then as you do your rotation, you'll see the fluctuation in the needle to indicate what you're working with. So in that case, we could do a quick rotation just to get a good idea of what we're working with. See, right now, the way that needle went from a little above zero backwards to like, it went backwards to like 75. That means that it released pressure on the plunger, which now means that this thing is actually, the thing actually went up a little bit. So this whole setup is clearly not straight. I'll have to actually tap on the opposite end of this thing to knock it back to where it's going to be a little straight. Now, rotate it some more. You'll see it goes to the opposite end when the thing rotates and pushes down on the plunger and pushes the gauge up past zero to around 14 thousandths. Rotate it. It goes as far as 25 thousandths on the high end, which means that the whole thing is pushed maximum into the, like, this is the farthest. Like that other end that was at 75 thousandths going backwards is now at 25 thousandths on the opposite end. So we go back and then same thing. We got a serious swing in numbers. You got a difference there going from 75 thousandths all the way to 25 thousandths. You got a 50 thousandths of an inch swing in the rotation. So our little yoke base thingy it's nowhere near straight. I'm gonna have to tap on this thing a little bit and try to get it straight. But even with a big gap on the numbers like that, don't think that it's okay to just start beating the crap out of stuff with a hammer trying to get it back straight. In this case, patience is a virtue. You gotta go easy, go slow, take it in baby steps so you don't end up messing up anything, if in no lesser terms knocking our gauge off the mount, because we may very well have that happen. So let me get the camera mount set up and we're gonna go ahead and start doing a little tapping. Stand by. We have to readjust everything. Because, well, tapping causes shit to move. Yeah, we still got that 50 thousandth swing.
A few moments later.
Okay, what we're looking at now, even though the gauge is not zeroed out, the low number is on 20. If I rotate it, as I go around, it fluctuates between 20, 21 to a high of 32. We fluctuate between essentially 12 thousandths of an inch on that run out number throughout the rotation, which according to a few different specs, I've seen some that say as low as 10. I've seen some that mention as high as 20 thousandths of an inch. So 12 thousandths of an inch run out apparently is a fair enough middle ground area that I could say we are probably within decent territory. So next move is going to be to throw a little tack welds on this thing so we can try to lock this thing in place and then check our numbers again. So hopefully we don't have to pull this garbage apart and redo everything. So stand by again.
As you can see, I have some pretty whack tacks on here, but our main purpose is to try to hold the yoke base in place so we don't lose our settings, our position, whatever you want to call it. But as you can see, as I'm rotating the thing, I'm still more or less maintaining that 12 thousandths of an inch run out change. Like the highest it's going is this point. I mean, I'm just going to redo it, try to get it to where it's on 0, just for the sake of just showing. A little above 0, like at 2, but it'll fluctuate around 6 on the high end, and then well, so far it's staying around there. The lowest I see it going is it'll go backwards to around 94, 93, give or take. And then it's gone as high as 6. So we're actually pretty good on our run out here, where it's not really fluctuating where we need to make any further adjustments. So I can actually say, well, that one went up to that little point right there, hit around 8. Not much, but it's just that one little point. But we're hovering, 0 is kind of the average, it's the middle ground. And when the plunger on the gauge drags for a second, it'll sometimes bounce. But we've seen that we're floating between 93 to 95 and as high as 8, give or take. So yeah, we're well within tolerance here, even after our tack welds. So with that in mind, I can go ahead and call this thing probably good enough that I could take this drive shaft off and go ahead and get a real welder, since this little crackerjack welder is nowhere near capable of making the welds necessary to ensure this thing stays together. So go ahead, it's dark out here, and get this crap put up now. But drive shaft's coming back off, so we can do our welds. So stand by for that.
All right, we got our drive shaft welded up. Did a nice clean-ish weld all the way around. It's clean, it just has a little more slag than normal. Grounded down to make it as even as possible all the way around, and no sign of any seam anywhere, so it's on there solid. Even though this is an old, kind of dinged up, pretty good drive shaft from the junkyard, this is obviously a first time experimental thing, so we'll see how this plays out. Well, for all intents and purposes, our drive shaft is pretty much a success. We were able to get the car up to near 60 miles an hour without any real signs of vibration or any other kind of issues that would indicate a flaw in the drive shaft. But if in the event there was a problem, one of the ways to remedy that problem as far as imbalance would have been kind of a crude way of doing it, but essentially jacking the rear wheels off the ground and making sure it's all secured on the rear end, then putting the car into gear and essentially driving the doggone car in place and revving it up to speed 60-70 miles an hour and putting some form of thing like a holder or something to hold like a piece of chalk or something. And what would happen is, if just like with the dial indicator, you have it mounted in position stationary, and the little piece of chalk would be like almost touching the drive shaft, and as the drive shaft wobbles back and forth, it would hit the piece of chalk. So when that happens, you'll know that this general area where the chalk mark is at, you're going to have to put some kind of weight on there. And most people would put like a worm clamp on there with the screw down block portion where your mark is at, since that's going to be the heaviest point of the worm clamp. And that right there would have been our balance for the drive shaft. But we don't have to do that, luckily, because I just don't like the idea of jacking a car up off the ground and rolling the wheels at the equivalent of 70 miles an hour, because obviously we're not on concrete, and just the idea of doing something like that with that kind of vibration is like a recipe for disaster, because all it takes is to make contact just a little bit with the ground and you're going to be shooting a car off down the driveway. It could be a mess. But like I said, luckily we got our drive shaft done well enough that we did not have to do that. Obviously we will have some more tests as we play around with this car some more, so we can confirm whether the drive shaft is indeed good up to super high speeds. We'll find that out eventually, and obviously we'll make updates on that. But as far as doing a drive shaft, shortening a drive shaft, what was seen is what is involved if you're trying to do that at the house, in the yard, in the garage. You need a dial caliper, and obviously you got to make sure to grind the shaft right where it's welded onto the yoke, so you can knock the yoke out and then shorten your drive shaft as needed and put it all back together as we've shown, so you can get it as straight as possible. But yeah, as for that, we're done with the drive shaft. The car is essentially done. A few little odds and ends that'll still need to be addressed on the car, but that's a whole nother story. But till the next time, as usual, like, subscribe, notifications, TikTok, all that good stuff. Stay tuned for more videos and updates on Truckstang as well as other car projects. So until then, I will catch you later.